At 6:12, the East Archive drawer was ajar. It should have been sealed. I noticed a thin buff folder pushed forward, its corner stamped private, a name typed beneath it that did not belong in record storage. I stopped before touching it, listening to the corridor hum. Procedures allow no curiosity here. Still, the air felt wrong, as if the building itself was holding breath. The drawer had been returned to its housing, but not fully seated. The metal runners faintly exposed, a deviation small enough to be missed by anyone not trained to notice symmetry in locked spaces, and the royal guard stood still in the East Archive corridor, with his gloved hand hovering inches from the handle, the fluorescent lighting above giving off a low, tired hum that flattened shadows and made the air feel colder than the temperature control suggested. His attention fixed on the buff folder pushed forward inside, stamped private in clean black type. The name beneath it unfamiliar, yet immediately alarming, because it belonged to a protected minor whose records should never transit through general archival storage. And he did not open it yet because protocol demanded verification before access, demanded restraint, demanded distance. So instead, he keyed the time into his internal log and scanned the corridor for movement, noting the absence of the junior archivist usually stationed nearby at this hour, noting the lack of digital seal confirmation on the drawer's edge, a red diode unlit where it should have glowed steady. And he felt the subtle internal shift that came when instinct pressed against procedure, not panic, but a narrowing, a quiet readiness. Because if the folder was here by error, then it represented negligence, and if it was here by design, then it represented something worse. And he initiated a silent chain of custody check through his wrist console, pulling the last authorized movement record, which showed a transfer scheduled for secure medical review 2 weeks prior, marked completed, yet the physical presence of the file contradicted that entry. And he exhaled slowly through his nose, the smell of paper and ozone faint but distinct, as he finally opened the drawer fully and removed the folder with deliberate care, holding it level as trained, resisting the urge to glance inside, instead checking the indexing tab, which showed a partial code, truncated, inconsistent with the palace's own cataloging standards. And that inconsistency mattered because standards existed to prevent exactly this kind of drift, this quiet misplacement of responsibility. And he sealed the drawer manually, applied a temporary lock tag, and stepped back into the corridor with the folder secured against his chest, already aware that the act of moving it, even under safeguard allowance, would be questioned, because nothing about the palace's internal systems tolerated deviation without consequence, especially when it involved children who were meant to exist only as abstracted entries, never as vulnerable bodies subject to adult decisions made behind closed doors. And as he walked toward the verification station, his pace remained even, boots soundless on the polished floor, while his mind cataloged the implications without naming them, because naming them too early would mean choosing a side before the facts were complete. And he had learned long ago that the most dangerous failures in the palace did not announce themselves loudly. They arrived mislabeled, half-logged, and politely out of place. At the verification desk, he placed the folder beneath the scanner pad and initiated a restricted access read, the system responding with a brief delay, longer than normal, just enough to register as resistance rather than malfunction. And when the authorization finally cleared, the screen displayed only 3 entries, each skeletal, lacking the usual cross-references, the kind of deliberate minimalism used when someone wanted a record to exist without being useful. And the guard did not read names beyond confirming the minor designation matched the stamp, because even that much knowledge carried weight. Instead, he focused on metadata, on timestamps and handling codes, noting that the last physical sign-off belonged to an administrative officer whose clearance level did not typically intersect with child welfare files, and that anomaly tightened the space behind his eyes, not as anger but as pressure, because it suggested authority had flowed sideways rather than down the proper channels. And he documented the discrepancy, attaching images of the folder's condition and the drawer's unsealed state, aware that documentation was both shield and exposure, depending on who read it next. And as he prepared to escalate the find through standard reporting, he received a soft chime indicating an incoming advisory from Records Administration, brief and non-specific, reminding all personnel that certain materials were under temporary internal review and should not be circulated, the timing too precise to be coincidence. And he paused, fingers resting on the console, weighing the language against what he had seen, because the advisory did not reference a retrieval order, did not cite an oversight body, did not instruct him to deliver the folder to a named custodian. It simply suggested restraint. And restraint in this context meant returning the object to the system that had misplaced it. And he chose instead to request a chain validation audit, a technically permitted but culturally discouraged move, especially when it involved sensitive names. And the response came back almost immediately, denying the request due to scheduling conflicts, which was administrative phrasing for refusal. And he stood there in the quiet archive room with the folder still unopened, the weight of it unchanged, but its significance now sharpened, because resistance had entered the process earlier than it should have, and that fact alone justified further action under safeguarding provisions. Yet he knew invoking those provisions would draw attention, would formalize concern before harm was proven, and the palace preferred certainty over caution when certainty preserved hierarchy. And so he made a smaller decision instead, one that could be defended as procedural housekeeping, rerouting the folder to temporary secure holding pending clarification, logging the transfer under his own identifier. And as the system accepted the entry, he felt the subtle shift of responsibility settle onto him, not as a burden, but as a line crossed, because from this point forward, the question would no longer be how the folder ended up in the wrong place, but why he had interfered. And he secured the file in the holding cabinet, sealed it with his personal code, and stood for a moment listening to the building systems resume their indifferent rhythm, aware that somewhere beyond the walls of records and corridors, a child existed whose safety depended not on declarations or intentions, but whether adults noticed when something was quietly, precisely out of place.
The notification arrived less than 10 minutes after the secure holding cabinet registered its seal, a request framed as routine clarification from administrative oversight, routed through channels designed to appear neutral while exerting pressure through proximity rather than command, and the Royal Guard acknowledged receipt without response, remaining at his post near the archive junction, where light shifted subtly as morning systems adjusted, his awareness fixed on process rather than tone, because tone was where influence hid. And he reviewed the request's metadata, noting it had bypassed 2 intermediate verification steps normally required for child-related materials, which meant someone with sufficient clearance had expedited it, not illegally, but assertively. And that distinction mattered because it defined the coming conflict as procedural rather than criminal, at least for now. And when he finally moved, it was toward the administrative wing, not carrying the folder, but carrying its reference number logged into his console, a choice that preserved custody while signaling cooperation. And the corridors there were warmer, paneled, designed to soften authority with comfort, yet the air felt dense with controlled quiet. And he was met by an assistant director whose expression was composed, professional, whose language emphasized efficiency and discretion, suggesting that the file in question was part of an internal alignment review and that its temporary relocation had been unnecessary, the words carefully chosen to avoid accusation. and the guard listened without interruption, noting the absence of any mention of the child, the focus instead placed on workflow integrity. And when he responded, it was to request written confirmation of the review's scope and supervising authority, a reasonable request that nonetheless shifted the balance, because documentation created traceability, and the assistant director hesitated just long enough for that fact to register, then deferred, citing scheduling constraints and promising follow-up. And the meeting ended without resolution, which was itself a form of resolution in palace terms, because unresolved matters defaulted to the status quo unless actively pursued. And as the guard returned to his station, he documented the exchange in neutral language, careful to record facts rather than impressions. Yet his internal assessment sharpened, because resistance had now taken a human form, not hostile, but insistent, grounded in rank rather than rationale. And he checked the logs again, this time focusing on briefing schedules linked to the administrative officer previously identified, discovering a private session listed for later that morning with no agenda attached, an omission rare in a system obsessed with order. And he flagged it quietly, understanding that each flag increased visibility, and visibility carried risk, not to him personally, but to the fragile line of protection around the child whose name remained unspoken. And as the morning progressed, the pressure did not escalate overtly. Instead, it diffused, small reminders sent, polite inquiries made, each one reinforcing the expectation that the folder would be returned to circulation. And he felt the familiar tension of protocol tightening, because protocol existed to prevent chaos, yet here it was being used to smooth over something unresolved. And he stood steady in that space, not defiant, not compliant, simply present, waiting for the moment when inaction would itself become a decision. That moment arrived when a revised directive appeared in the system, subtly altering access permissions for the secure holding cabinet under the guise of routine maintenance, a move that would effectively remove his custodial control without direct confrontation. And the guard recognized it immediately for what it was, a procedural sidestep that preserved hierarchy while nullifying safeguard intent. And he acted within minutes, not by blocking the change, which would have required justification, but by filing a discrepancy report tied to the missing log entry he had identified earlier, formally linking the administrative briefing schedule to the file's irregular handling, a connection grounded in timestamps rather than accusation. And the system accepted the report, routing it automatically to compliance review, a layer of oversight rarely invoked because it slowed processes and invited scrutiny. And as the confirmation pinged his console, he felt the shift again, responsibility settling deeper now, because compliance review did not belong to any single office, it belonged to the record itself. And records once elevated were difficult to bury. And the response from administration came swiftly, firmer in tone, requesting an immediate meeting. And when he attended, it was with 2 additional officials present, their demeanor controlled, their questions precise, circling his actions without directly challenging them. And he answered with equal precision, citing policy language verbatim, referencing safeguarding clauses that allowed temporary custody when a protected minor's records appeared compromised. And there was no raised voice, no threat, only the quiet recalibration of power as it became clear that reversing his steps would require overt override, something no one was yet willing to authorize. And the meeting concluded with a provisional stand-down, the folder to remain secured pending further review. And as he left the room, he noted the way eyes followed him, not with hostility, but calculation, because he had demonstrated that procedure could be used to resist as well as enforce, and that knowledge unsettled systems built on predictability. And back at his post, he updated his log, aware that the story was no longer confined to a misplaced file, but had expanded into the mechanisms that allowed such misplacement to occur unnoticed. And as he stood there listening to the palace resume its measured rhythm, he understood that the next step could not be administrative, because administration dealt in abstractions, and what this situation required now was confirmation of reality beyond paper. A quiet check that would either validate concern or release it, and the decision to move toward that confirmation formed without drama, simply as the next logical action in a sequence that had already begun, one that would place him closer to the child at the center of the file, and closer to the line where protocol ended and responsibility began. He initiated the welfare confirmation under a safeguard provision rarely used in practice, one that allowed observational verification without triggering formal alerts. And the process required discretion more than speed, because speed invited attention, and attention reshaped narratives before facts could settle. So he moved through the residential wing at a measured pace, his presence indistinguishable from routine patrol, noting how the light softened as it filtered through high windows, how sound dampened over carpeted floors designed to mute urgency. And when he reached the antechamber outside the child's quarters, he paused, not because he hesitated, but because pausing was part of the discipline, allowing the environment to speak before he acted. And what it revealed was subtle, the air warmer than expected, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering beneath floral polish, the door sensors showing an unusual pattern of late-night access clustered around medical staff identifiers rather than household ones. And he logged these observations without inference, because inference came later. And he signaled the attendant on duty, requesting entry under routine security verification. And the attendant complied without question, the interaction brief, professional. And once inside the outer room, he kept his movements minimal, eyes adjusting to the dimness, ears attuned to the soft mechanical rhythm of environmental controls. And the child lay sleeping beyond the inner threshold, posture relaxed, yet positioned with care, monitors silent except for the steady confirmation of breath. And he did not approach immediately, instead scanning the room for signs of recent activity, a chair slightly misaligned, a curtain drawn back more than daytime protocol allowed, a medical kit secured but placed closer to the bedside than standard. And none of these details alone constituted alarm, but together they suggested oversight had been active, frequent, perhaps excessive. And he checked the environmental log, noting manual overrides that corresponded with the same gaps he had seen in the records, times when systems recorded presence without purpose. And he felt the quiet tightening again, because the absence of harm did not negate the presence of risk. And he approached the bedside only after confirming his gloves were clean, his steps deliberate, and he observed the child's face without touching, noting the faint discoloration at the edge of a bandage placed too precisely to be casual, too neatly to be rushed. And he recorded that, too, resisting the urge to adjust anything, because adjustment altered evidence, and his role here was not comfort but confirmation. And as he stood there, the weight of the situation clarified, not as a crisis, but as a pattern, one where authority had been exercised repeatedly without transparency, justified perhaps by concern, perhaps by convenience, but always without the checks designed to protect those with no voice in the process. And he stepped back, leaving the room as he found it, sealing nothing, changing nothing, carrying only the accumulation of small facts that together demanded escalation. The return walk felt longer despite covering the same distance, his awareness sharpened now by proximity to what the file represented. And he documented the visit immediately, time-stamping each observation, attaching system logs, careful to separate fact from assessment, because the integrity of the record mattered more than the urgency of his concern. And as he compiled the report, he noted how each entry intersected with the folder's irregularities, forming a coherent line that could be followed by anyone willing to look, and that willingness was the variable he could not control. And he submitted the report to the secure holding reference, linking it under safeguarding continuation rather than incident declaration, a choice that preserved discretion while escalating oversight. And the system acknowledged receipt with a neutral confirmation, and he waited, standing in the operations room where screens displayed steady flows of routine data. And the response came not as approval or denial, but as silence, a pause that indicated review was underway at a level removed from immediate administration. And that silence was protective because it delayed interference. And during that interval, he received a message from medical services requesting clarification on access logs, phrased as a technical inquiry. And he replied with the same precision he had used all morning, providing data without interpretation. And the exchange remained professional, controlled, yet beneath it he sensed recalibration, the recognition that oversight had shifted from informal to formal. And when the compliance unit finally responded, it did so with a request for temporary evidence control, authorizing seizure of related materials pending assessment, a step that transformed his quiet concern into an official process. And he moved without ceremony to enact it, retrieving the marked folder, duplicating its contents under sealed conditions, and expanding the scope to include associated logs, all actions taken under policy language that left little room for objection. And as he worked, he felt no triumph, only the steady progression of duty fulfilled, because exposure here was not about blame, but about restoring boundaries that had eroded quietly over time. And when he finished, he secured the materials and transmitted notification to independent oversight, completing the chain that removed the matter from internal negotiation. And as the palace settled into palace rhythms, he stood again at his post, the day's events absorbed into the record, aware that the child slept still, unharmed for now, protected not by declarations of intent, but by the simple fact that someone had noticed when something felt wrong and had chosen to act within the narrow space allowed. And he understood that whatever consequences followed would unfold slowly, through files and reviews and carefully worded conclusions, but the immediate purpose had been met, because the line between authority and misuse had been marked, not with confrontation, but with documentation that could not easily be undone.
The authorization carried no ceremony, only a numeric string and a scope definition that expanded custody from a single folder to a narrow band of associated materials, and the Royal Guard read it twice before acting, because scope was where excess began, and excess compromised credibility. So he moved methodically, retrieving only what the order allowed, starting with the original file now duplicated under seal, then the access logs tied to its movement, then the environmental overrides from the residential wing, each item collected in sequence, each action time-stamped, the room quiet except for the soft mechanical confirmations of system compliance, and he felt the shift in the palace's posture as he worked, not resistance now, but caution, a subtle recalibration as staff recognized that the matter had passed beyond internal discretion. And when an administrator arrived to observe, not intervene, their presence remained peripheral, questions deferred, because oversight had weight only when it remained impersonal, and he maintained that distance, answering only when required, never volunteering interpretation. And the process took longer than it should have, because systems designed for efficiency slowed under scrutiny, a feature, not a flaw. And when the materials were secured, he initiated the final step, transferring custody acknowledgement to the independent unit's ledger, an act that closed the internal loop and opened an external one.
and the confirmation returned with a delayed signature, evidence that multiple reviewers had touched it. And as the seal locked, he felt the tension ease, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was now contained. And containment mattered in places where reputation and continuity were prized. And he documented the seizure in plain language, avoiding conclusions, allowing the record to speak for itself. And as he completed the entry, he noted the time, late afternoon, the palace transitioning toward evening routines, staff rotations changing, attention diffusing, and that diffusion was protective because it prevented the formation of a single narrative driven by urgency rather than fact. And he returned the keys, reset the access panels, and stepped back into the corridor, where the air felt cooler, the light angled lower. And he stood for a moment, listening to the building's steady hum, aware that what he had done would not be discussed openly, not tonight, perhaps not ever in public terms, because the palace resolved such matters through quiet correction rather than acknowledgement. And yet the correction here had substance, because a child's records were no longer subject to informal handling, and the line had been drawn not by confrontation, but by adherence to process when process was inconvenient. And he resumed his post, posture unchanged, presence unremarkable, knowing that the measure of success in this place was often the absence of visible consequence, the fact that the child would wake to the same room, the same routines, unaware that anything had shifted, and that was as it should be. The evening brought no immediate fallout, only a series of acknowledgments logged and archived, the administrative tone returning to neutral, as if the day's irregularities had been absorbed into the palace's larger inertia. And the royal guard monitored the systems as he always did, noting how access patterns normalized, how medical entries began to align with standard reporting intervals. Small corrections that indicated oversight had already begun to exert pressure without instruction. And he received a brief notice from compliance confirming receipt of materials and advising no further action pending review, language that closed his active role while preserving accountability. And he accepted it without response, because acceptance here was not agreement but recognition of boundary. And later, during a routine check near the residential wing, he observed the antechamber again, unchanged, the same quiet order restored, and he did not enter, because entry was no longer warranted, and restraint now served the same purpose as action had earlier. And as the hours passed, the palace settled fully into night, the rhythms familiar, the systems reliable. And he reflected not on outcomes but on process, on how easily authority could drift when unchecked, not through malice but through convenience, and how safeguards existed precisely to interrupt that drift before it touched those least able to resist. And he considered the nurse whose panic had first drawn attention, not as a villain, but as a node in a system that had blurred lines. And he understood that the review would likely result in quiet reassignment, revised protocols, additional signatures required, the usual remedies that preserved stability while correcting error. And none of that required his presence now. And that too was correct, because the guard's role was not to be central, but to be reliable, to notice the open drawer, the missing entry, the small thing that did not belong, and to act without spectacle. And as he completed his final log of the shift, he wrote nothing about instinct, nothing about feeling, only the sequence of actions taken and the reasons permitted by policy. And he closed the entry, secured his console, and stood at attention as the clock marked the hour, the palace breathing evenly around him. And somewhere beyond walls and protocols, a child slept, protected not by the myth of authority, but by its restraint. And the record, once made, would continue to do its work long after the corridor returned to silence.